Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Zession. If you are new here, we are so excited that you're joining us today. My name is Mandy Rourke, and I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I am located in Austin, but support clients over throughout Texas. I am also a co-founder of Zessio.
And I'm Sapna Srivastav and fellow co-founder of Zessio. And so Zessions are conversations among clinicians. We talk about topics that are typically addressed in the mental health world so that there's the perspective of clinicians who support clients on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. And today, our topic, it's an exciting one. It's Adulting 101. And we have had so much fun prepping for this. And we're really excited to welcome Zoe Thomas, who is an LPC, one of our partners at Zesio. She works in Houston. She is busy. She works hard. I'm seeing all of it online. You are just doing so much impactful work. And I know you've also kind of main specialty is working with young adults with identity issues or low self-esteem and anxiety, but feel free to introduce yourself and share anything else that would be helpful for us to know.
Yeah, so I'm Zoe. I'm a licensed therapist, coach, consultant, and content creator. So you can find me at the School for Therapy, where I help to demystify and destigmify mental health and therapy one post at a time. And I'm so excited to talk about this topic. It needs to be said. We need to have this conversation. So I'm really looking forward to it.
Agreed. We were laughing a little bit before this because we are adults. And as we start kind of unpacking what Adulting 101 means, we want to also give the little kind of lighthearted disclaimer here that as adults, we're going through some adulting things right now. And so we wanted to say that we don't want any of our hard adult moments to come out and taint the excitement of Adulting 101, but also want to acknowledge that adulting is real. There's a lot, there's a lot that goes into it.
And it's not always exciting, and that's perfectly fine. Like literally anything else, like it's not a linear experience. There's going to be bumps and twists and turns and crappy days and good days, and that just comes with the territory. So it's all good. Y'all are just being human.
Yeah, exactly.
We love that normalization of that process of adulting, because yes, there's the possibility of a little hint of cynicism that might come out. So if it does, please, audience, do take it with many grains of salt. It's just a moment. But on that note, we are genuinely, believe it or not, still genuinely excited to talk about this, especially with you, Zoe. And so what makes this topic such a passion for you? What has you thinking like this is a topic that definitely needs to be discussed?
So, I specialize in working with young adults. So this is something that comes up all the time in therapy. And ultimately, like if you're fortunate to live past 18 years old, you are going to inevitably have to make the transition into adulthood. So it's a universal experience. It is a transition. And it's a journey. And I think it's important that, especially young adults, but also clinicians working with young adults are able to conceptualize the journey and provide encouragement and feedback and a different perspective on this topic. I think a lot of the times when we think about adulting, like it's dreadful that the tone of the conversation around being an adult is so dreadful all of the time. And don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong. We all have our days, right? Like constantly those moments, those days where it's just like, I don't want to do it. That happens very often. But it doesn't make up all of the experience. And even in the discomfort of it all, the inconvenience of it all, the difficulty of it all, there can still be bright lights that shine through that even still. And so I'm just happy to be able to take what I share with my clients in these one-on-one sessions and bring it to this platform, and hopefully it impacts someone else.
Yeah, for sure. I like the way that you're describing kind of your passion behind this and also your experience. I mean, this is something that I'm sure, hearing a lot of kind of the inside processings of people actively going through this transition. So first, like if I was a client, how would you define to me what adulting means specifically?
Yeah, so I see becoming an adult as the process of becoming an independent, well-rounded, self-sufficient human being. So it's really the process of going from um, being reliant and dependent on your caregivers, but also like a process of maturity and growing up and seeing the world different, seeing other people different. Taking your life more seriously is also a part of being an adult. And I think a lot of the narrative around adulting is like, oh, well, you gotta go to work every day and pay your bills and, get paid and then just give that money to everybody else. And that's what makes up the adult experience. And that's not necessarily true. It really is a full experience with all kinds of layers. And I think people would feel more empowered to embrace adulthood if they understood what those layers look like, right? So learning how to have grown adult conversations, learning how to set boundaries, learning how to create goals and figuring out how to get there, embracing more responsibility, making it fun. You're gonna have to learn how to cook and, do your own laundry and write a check and establish credit. And like also these can be new and fun experiences depending on how you choose to look at it. So it really is the process of growing up, being able to take care of yourself, being a well-rounded individual, and utilizing the autonomy that you have in a positive way and for your own good, to me.
Yeah, the well-rounded. I feel like some of us are still aiming for, even though we've been in it for a minute. And so what are some of the frequent issues that you see your clients kind of dealing with around adulting that you support them around? And are there like shifts that you've noticed over time? Like, what does that look like for you in your clinical work?
Yeah, so I work in a university setting. So all of my clients are in undergraduate. Well, that's not true. Some are in grad school, but a lot of my young adults are pursuing their undergraduate degree. And so as graduation nears, there's like this mix of excitement, but also dread, because they are excited to finally, achieve this big thing that they've been pursuing for years. They're excited to, have more independence, but they're really scared to leave the nest that they've been in for the last 20 to 21 years or 22 years. And so as my clients get closer and closer to graduation, the anxiety sinks in, the imposter syndrome sinks in. They're asking themselves, can I do this? I don't know. I'm so nervous. What's going to happen? There's a lot of fear of the unknown, fear of the future. And just these concerns that they're not going to know how to do this. They're not going to know how to do this adulting thing. So I see that a lot. And so I spend a lot of time empowering my clients and teaching them how to trust themselves, and teaching them how to look at this transition in a different light.
That's great. Because as you're talking about that, it makes me think of like there's freedom in becoming an adult, right? But it's also like an unfamiliar sense of freedom of, maybe I know my mom, whenever I was a kid, was like, you were born 30, like I always wanted to be older, older, and older. And then once you're like, oh crap, like I have to do all this, like, wait, I need to like think about what I actually feel or what I actually need. And then how do I actually take action on things? It's a little overwhelming. And there's also like push and pull from, how am I supposed to live as an adult? What messages have been taught to me about what adulthood looks like too. So it's like, yay, I'm excited. I'm finally hitting that mark, but also like, what? Like, this is unfamiliar. I don't know what to do with this. Right.
Yeah, definitely. It's intimidating. It's scary. And I also think, I don't know how many parents are really preparing their kids for adulthood. And I know this was a topic that we were going to address later on, but it's something to make note of as well is I think just like anything in the human experience, like your confidence has to be cultivated. It has to be built. It has to be invested into. And so as a child, that should, right, quote unquote, should come from your primary caregivers. And so for the clients that I see, I work at a very unique university. There's a lot of first generation students, a lot of children of immigrants. We don't have on-campus housing. It's not a traditional university. And so my students aren't traditional students. They come with unique backgrounds and experiences and family dynamics. And so a lot of the times they aren't encouraged to embrace independence. They're not encouraged to see that as a good thing. They're not really encouraged to grow a lot of the time as well by their caregivers. And so that can just make it even more scary and even more intimidating to think about leaving the nest and flying out on your own. It's terrifying for them, understandably so.
Yeah, I appreciate that you brought that up, because I was just thinking that too, like that role of culture within the process of adulting and what it can look like, how it can look different in different cultures to become an adult. And kind of especially thinking of like the level of closeness and even proximity with older family members can be really different, or the expectations around that can be really different. And even just as you were talking too, just generally like the fear of failure is what I feel like I'm hearing. And maybe it's a little projection, who knows? But it's a little fear of failure. And I also think it feels like the stakes are higher with the unknowns being greater.
Yeah.
When you're adulting, and especially if you haven't felt like you've gotten the skills or like the kind of training or know-how of what is expected of you and how to actually go about doing it. And like, if you fail, like, does that mean that you're not going to be able to pay your bills, like, and survive and like, meet your own basic needs and like fall on your face?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what it is. It is a fear of failure. And with that, the consequences feel heavier as well, right? So, it's not like being in high school and you fail a test and all you have to deal with is a parent getting on you about it, or grounding you, or taking your phone away, or whatever the case may be. There are bigger consequences in adulthood for our mistakes. That is just simply a fact. And so I definitely feel that a lot of my clients are afraid of like, what do these big consequences look like? They're afraid that like, am I going to end up on the streets one day? Am I going to get evicted? Will I be able to pay this car note? What does that look like? What does my quality of life look like? If I can't perform well at a job, am I going to get fired? And what happens next? And so that's another added layer to the fear, is the weight of the consequences that come with things not going as planned or mistakes happening. And so that's something that my clients bring up a lot in session as well.
Well, as you're saying all of that, it's like the safety net that, we're accustomed to maybe having as a kid. It doesn't feel like it's as big as it once was when you become an adult. And I just think about my kiddo, and after having her for the first time, and as I started seeing the world through her eyes, I was like, man, this is fun. This is really fun to be a kid. Like the sense of wonder and just like pure joy. And I really am sounding like a jaded adult right now as I'm saying this, of like, wow, like how nice must that feel? But I've been able to access it a little bit with her. But as you're describing all of this, what comes up for me is that, she doesn't have to hold the worry or the anxiety. That's my job as her parent, right? But then it's like becoming an adult is the first time that you're like, oh, holy F, like there's a lot of anxiety and worry that has been carried for me. And now I have to confront that. So from a mental health perspective, I'm starting to feel things emotionally speaking that I've never experienced, or if I have, it's felt kind of in this container of like safety, hopefully within that dynamic of family and stuff. But it's like, I imagine that's a lot of your work too, of like, how do you emotionally process what's happening? How do you manage just the surge of the fears and anxieties of what it means to be like self-sufficient, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And for my clients, coming to therapy is the first step to figuring out, what does that look like? Like, how do you regulate your emotions? How do you process your fears? How do you find solutions to potential problems? How do you trust yourself? I think that's a really big theme as well, is I find myself constantly working with my clients to, one, like zoom out, because typically when they are feeling afraid and anxious, they're so zoomed into the problem and what could happen and what things could look like. And so one thing I do with them is like, okay, let's zoom all the way out and just take this one step at a time, right? Like instead of like jumping the gun, like what does just one step forward look like? So as an example, I'll have clients who are worried about being an adult or scared of the future, but like they don't even have a driver's license. So let's zoom out, right? Let's start somewhere. Let's work on getting a license. Let's work on learning how to drive a car. And I always tell them, like, being an adult is just a combination of skills that you have learned over time that you are using in your everyday life. And all of us as human beings are capable of learning. Every single one of us, we are capable of learning. And so I encourage them to have the perspective of, okay, maybe you're not learning about psychology or algebra or history or whatever the case may be. You're learning about life, the greatest subject in the world, the most important subject in the world. That's what the transition to adulthood is. That's what being an adult is, truly, even over the course of the lifespan. It is a constant process of learning and relearning and trial and error and things not working and learning how to be resilient and get up again and move forward and pivot and try something else. That's all this is. And so when I simplify it for them in that way and have them recognize, like, hey, you know how to learn. You've been doing it this whole time, right? We know how to do that. We know how to learn. What is the first thing that we can learn to help you prepare for adulthood? And to kind of simplify it in that way, it makes them feel more at ease. Like, okay, I don't have to go into this transition knowing everything. No, you don't. And you won't. That's never the expectation. But instead, being open to figuring it out, trusting yourself to figure it out, trusting yourself to learn and apply what you learn, and then just taking it one step at a time from there on tends to be really helpful.
Yeah, I really appreciate that reframe and that analogy, because what's coming to mind for me is like you're literally learning on the job, and like considering adulting as the job, even when you probably have a job or two within that job. But it's helping to focus kind of on the journey and on the process of like constantly learning. And as someone who's also been working on this process of adulting for a minute, it's also a helpful reminder of like, we're constantly going to be relearning based on these circumstances too. And like, I think the world as a whole had to relearn a lot of things over the last couple of years as well that we don't necessarily give ourselves enough credit for. And we're still navigating in a lot of ways. And so I appreciate that that reframe as well. And I was also wondering if there's any other particular things that come up for you in your work with your clients regarding kind of like the influence of the pandemic and like any political things, or, all the things, all the pressures that young adults tend to deal with on a regular basis these days as well.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about how the developmental psychology of adolescence has been affected by the pandemic. I don't think the research is out yet. I think it's too early. And I know that that's being researched now, but I feel in my spirit that the pandemic has had a major influence on the perspectives, outlook, resilience, and attitudes of adolescents on life in general. And the reason I say that is because under normal circumstances, quote unquote, normal, developmentally, adolescents are supposed to be seeking independence, right? They are supposed to be having new experiences, making new friends. Maybe they are going on trips. They're spending the night at friend's house. They are doing things to kind of begin to break away from the dependence on their parents. And this is developmentally appropriate. Adolescents, under normal circumstances as well, have a level of invincibility, right? So they believe like nothing can happen to me. I'm rocking out, I'm having fun, life is good, bad things don't occur to me, bad things don't happen to me. And I think something that the pandemic taught adolescence is, no, bad things can happen to you. Bad things can happen to everybody, regardless of how old you are. And also, I think the influence of social media, right? And having news constantly. When I was a teenager, I didn't know what was going on in the world unless there was like something really wrong. Like I remember 9/11. I remember huge world events that happened. But other than that, I wasn't as tuned in and as aware as young adults and teenagers are now, because I did not have access to the news right in the palm of my hand all the time. And I'm thankful for that, because I think I would be just as anxious. I would be just as afraid of the world. I would be just as intimidated and reluctant to move out of my parents' house and go into this mess. No, thank you. I would be very, very scared. And so I think that the combination of the pandemic and like living in this digital era has definitely had an influence on the mental health of teenagers and young adults. And so although having this attitude of invincibility is not healthy or sustainable, I think without that, a lot of young adults may lack resilience or the willing to take risks, the willingness to be able to try things and just see what happens. A lot of my clients suffer from perfectionism, and I don't think that is a coincidence. And so the pandemic has just, I think it's stunted their growth in certain ways. And it's really going to be interesting to see, the overall impact of that on this generation in particular. What is it, Gen Z? I think it's had a huge negative impact. So a lot of the work that I do with my clients is like from the ground up, okay, let's build resilience. How do we increase your confidence? How do we increase your self-esteem? How can we change the way your expectations of yourself, and feeling like being an adult has to be perfect. Everything has to be put together all the time. The fear of bad things happening. Okay, bad things can happen, right? Let's acknowledge that. But I like to do a little game called worst case scenario. Okay, let's sit with it. Let's consider the worst case scenario. What would you do? I do a lot of that with my clients as well, to get them to understand, like, this is figure outable. You can figure out what's next. You are able to be resourceful enough to make it through disappointments and setbacks and illness and tragedies, and reminding them that it's human nature to survive. We have a survival instinct in all of us. It is innate. We are born with it. It is primal. It's not something that you have to earn. It's not something that you have to be good enough to get. It is already within you. And so a level of self-trust and reliance on themselves to recognize, like, I'm gonna figure it out. I'm not gonna allow myself to crumble. I'm not going to allow myself to fail. And although they haven't had to necessarily experience that yet and test that, empowering them to recognize that your willingness to go on is already within you. It's in your essence. So there's a lot of that kind of work that I tend to do. And I think that's how the pandemic has just made it more difficult for that work to take place. I also think because of the pandemic, young adults have relied more on their parents, right? When we think about like how developmentally they should be seeking independence, I think there was a flip with the pandemic, where they became more dependent on their parents and more dependent on their families. Rightfully so. We all had to come together and survive the experience. But that critical period where you're supposed to be trusting yourself, trying new things, experimenting, having new experiences, that just didn't happen. And I think it's still having consequences currently.
Mm-hmm. Major consequences still. And I think there's a couple of big things that you're saying here that I think would be good to kind of unpack individually too. I mean, the social media thing in my work has been pretty startling to see the impact, because I mean, as you're saying, like, that there's so much reliance. I mean, in some ways it was great that we had that, but then in other ways, as we're talking about this development of identity or identity formation of like, who am I? What do I want my life to look like? If I'm on Instagram seeing a blogger's life, or an influencer's life constantly, that sets that, some of these people that I follow, and I kind of don't anymore because of this, because it's like they're setting this standard of like perfectionism because it's the culture of social media to put out like kind of your best foot forward. We're not usually showing ourselves when, the really hard adulting moments are happening. So it sets these unrealistic or false expectations or out of reach for a lot of people. But I also just think it's there's benefits to it, but it harms that natural process of like having some protected space to figure your own self out of like, who do I really want to be? Because I think kind of the second part of that, which is huge, is, you're essentially helping people develop their trust in themselves, which kind of going back to that safety net example, it's like they are their safety net, but it's like, how do I trust myself? I have to know myself. Well, who am I and where do I figure that out? It's like, even as I say it right now, I'm like, that feels kind of overwhelming just to acknowledge, right? But all we're really doing is taking it like, what's the next right thing? What's the next tool I'm going to put in my toolkit that's now going to be part of my internal resources? That's my safety net to just kind of hold myself in this world and this human experience, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And as far as like the perfectionism and social media, that is such an issue. It is really causing young adults to struggle in their own skin, in their own bodies, with their own families, with their own realities. And I've seen a lot of my clients kind of view being an adult as like, well, almost like it needs to be aesthetically pleasing. It's supposed to look good. How does it appear? How will it look on Instagram? How will it look on TikTok? And there's so much comparison. So much comparison. And you bring up a good point around identity formation. I do a lot of identity formation work with my clients, and it is overwhelming. It is overwhelming. It's a journey. I always tell them, like, this is life work, right? Like, so just go ahead and recognize that this isn't something that you're going to cross off your list in a year and just be done with it. Like, no, you are going to always be in a process of learning about yourself, figuring out who you are, what you like, what you dislike. And so also giving them realistic expectations of themselves takes off the stress and the pressure as well, because I think a lot of young adults feel like they have to figure these things out now. I got to hurry up. It has to be together. I graduate in 2 months. I need to be ready by then. And so letting them know that like, this is a life's journey. Get comfortable. You know what I'm saying? Kick your feet up. Be patient with yourself, find your pace, and it is going to be all right in the end. As far as identity formation, I focus a lot on helping my clients identify and discover their authentic selves. And so I always say, when you're trying to figure out who you are authentically, the first place to go to is what feels like ease. What comes to me naturally? What do I naturally like? What do I naturally dislike? What do I naturally want to wear, right? If you feel most comfortable in a hoodie and sweatpants, that's you. That's okay. You don't have to squeeze yourself into anything else. If that's what you love, it is valid. It's perfectly fine. So it's initially the process of getting them to be consciously aware in their day-to-day of like, what feels like ease for me? What feels comfortable for me? What feels natural for me? What naturally makes me happy and puts me in a good headspace? That is who you are. Whatever makes that up is who you are in that current moment. And we all have seasons. We change over time, and that's perfectly fine. And that's why it is a life's work. And you'll always be checking in with yourself to figure out who you are in any given season of your life. But I think the hardest part of this journey is helping them understand that that's enough, that who you are is enough. You literally do not need to be anything else. And so when we talk about social media and influencer culture, that's where it gets real sticky. And they have a really, really, really hard time accepting and understanding that, like, really, me just liking to read books and walk my dog and relax at home and play video games all day, like, that's enough? Are you sure? Because it feels like it isn't. It feels like I should be dating. It feels like I should be buying designer bags. It feels like I should be posting on Instagram every single day. And so that tends to be where I see a lot of resistance with my clients, is just this struggle to accept that who they are is enough. And that journey in itself, again, it takes time. I often remind them, like, hey, your brain isn't even fully developed. So the way you feel about yourself right now, it's probably going to change in a few years. I always let them know, like, you got to let time do its thing. I'm giving you the skills. I'm giving you the tools. I'm planting these seeds in your brain. When it's time to give them water and sunlight, you're going to know. You're going to know when it's time. And the things that I'm saying right now, they may not click in this moment, but at some point, they're going to make sense. And you're going to remember this moment. And you're going to remember when you couldn't accept it, you couldn't believe it, you couldn't wrap your head around it. And you're going to get to a point where it's like, I know what Zoe was talking about. Okay, I'm experiencing it firsthand. So that's another part of the work that I do, is having them understand that, like, hey, it's okay if it all doesn't click right now. It's okay if it doesn't feel real this year. That's okay. Just receive it. Just receive it. Hold on to it. Think about it. Continue to think about it. And it's going to fall into place mentally at some point.
Yeah, there's so many gems within that. I'm like, which one do I focus on next? I love the normalizing of that process, again, of it is going to take time, and you don't have to have it all figured out. I mean, it sounds, it feels like a job situation. There's going to be a little more pressure to figure it out sooner rather than later, usually in most cases. But everything else, like, it's going to be a transition process, like anything else. Like when you went to college, or when you started your first job, or anything like that. Like, you didn't necessarily, more than likely, pick everything up immediately perfectly right away. And if you did, congrats, that's a fluke, man. Like,
right?
It's not, like, that's not how life is always. And it's okay for the stumbling rocks to be there. That's very, very normal, despite what social media tends to share. And so I love that continued normalization. I feel like most people, especially in the social media age, can't be reminded of that enough, that it is very, very normal to stumble. And you don't see other people doing that because they don't necessarily share that. They're sharing their highlight reel. And so you don't know that that's a normal thing that other people are going through, unless you are being safe enough to be vulnerable and sharing that yourself. And otherwise have other, like, amazing people in your world, including clinicians, who are reminding you of that on a regular basis. I also really loved kind of your suggestion of taking the first step of, like, focusing on what comes really easy to you, what feels natural for you, what your inherent joys are. Really, really love that as, like, a concrete first step of, like, just kind of slowing down and, like, becoming more in tune with yourself, and, like, accepting, like, that's okay for me to enjoy that. And honestly, I started feeling some kind of way about it myself, of, like, you need to give yourself permission to do that, and to, like, unlearn any of the conditioning that you've grown up with that says that you need to focus on the shoulds more than is actually going on for you. Because those shoulds, like, I think that's kind of a trigger word of what you were saying before too, of, I should be buying the designer bag. I should be, like, going for this giant promotion. Like, I should be, doing this or that. Whereas, like, where you are right now, being who you are, being present in that moment is perfectly okay. You are allowed to enjoy that. And if that's what you have to practice, is, like, giving yourself that permission and unlearning anything that tells you otherwise, that can be its own first step. That might also take time in the journey.
Absolutely. And something I always say is, like, what a relief it is to not have to figure out how to be in a position where you can buy designer bags and get flown out and partner with brands. Like, that's a lot of work. It's a lot of responsibility. It's very stressful. You get to be a young adult figuring it out. And as scary as that can sound, it is it is actually a much more simple existence than it sounds, than the opposite, right? Than what people are seeing on social media. You get to learn about yourself. You get to spend time with yourself and figure out who you are. You get to experiment and have different experiences and try new things and go to this place and try out this boundary and have this conversation, and figure out, what do you like to do for fun? What do you want your career to look like? Dip a toe here, dip a toe there. That sounds much more enjoyable to me than trying to propel and accelerate to this place in life that really is not developmentally appropriate for where you are. It's completely unnatural. And I think that the presence of social media has made young adults want to skip these steps, right? And just get there already. It has kind of it's turned the process and the journey into this myth that I don't think they really understand actually exists. That life is nothing but putting one foot in front of the other. That's all it is. It's nothing but baby steps every single day, every single moment of your life. And we don't get to skip steps. We don't get to hop, skip, and jump to our most ultimate destination whenever we want to. That's not how it works. It is a climb. It is a build. It is a process. It's slow. It's slow. Go ahead and accept that. Yeah.
Adulting is baby steps, is taking baby steps, right? Mm-hmm. I want to go back to something too, because I'm kind of laughing over here to myself about my first job outside of college was in a corporate learning and development department. And I remember, I'm 21, 22 at the time getting this job. And a lot of the people who I was facilitating training material to were much older. And so it made me start thinking about the imposter syndrome. And what I actually went and cut my hair to be shorter because people were commenting on how young I looked. And I remember at that time being this is brutal. I'm qualified to be here. I'm doing the job, but I also feel it was almost like a, what do you call it? Is it hazing kind of environment within the professional space too, to earn your seat at that table. And for me, it was if I cut my hair and I'll look a little bit older and then I won't get this kind of response. And I don't know if that made any difference. Honestly, I grew back out. So I was what am I doing? But it's so natural to get caught in that trap of I'm supposed to, because it was almost as I'm reflecting upon that, it was me with short hair was what an adult was supposed to look like. That was more responsible or more professional, or I had to fit in some kind of mold of what an adult professional woman looked like. And now I'm man, it's hindsight, right? But also I'm sure that, you mentioned that imposter syndrome piece. What other kind of tips do you share with your clients around feeling like you're supposed to be a certain way and you're not? So just put on a good show, or is that what it means to you? Or what do you think?
No. So, this is a tricky one for me because as a 30-year-old, right, I'm constantly circulating between my 30-year-old perspective, but also trying to meet my clients where they are at in their 20-year-old perspective. And so time and reflection has given me the perspective to recognize that first of all, I already got a seat at the table. I don't need to earn it more. I'm already here, right? I'm here. So that shows that I am meant to be here. But, 20-year-old Zoe would have had a different perspective. She would have felt like she had to go out of her way or, make herself small or, whatever the case may be. And so I recognize that my clients, who are in their 20s and are feeling intimidated or have imposter syndrome or feel like they are not enough, probably share the same perspective of am I good enough? How do I show that I'm good enough? What do I need to do to prove X, Y, and Z? And so there's a part of me that's you know what? I would tell my clients you are good as you are, but here's the thing. I do also feel like a part of life, especially in your 20s, especially your early 20s, is doing things like cutting your hair to try to prove a point or try to be seen differently, and having that experience teach you that it really doesn't matter at the end of the day. Like, I also feel like there are some parts of the transition to adulthood, although it doesn't look good on paper, maybe it just needs to happen for the lesson to really be digested. You know what I'm saying? So the therapist in me wants to reassure my clients and say, that's really not going to make a difference. Who you are is great. Who you are is enough. But I think a lot of the times, kind of thinking about how life is our teacher, living and letting things like that happen can be a more powerful teacher and lesson for young adults moving forward. Now, obviously, there's levels to this, right? Like, clearly, there are just some things that we don't want people to do, like some situations that, I never want my clients to put themselves in danger or in harm's way in order to learn a life lesson. No, never want that. But there are some things like this that just feel like, okay, this is your coming of age story, right? This is how you learned what's real, what's not, what's true, what's false, and learning on the job, learning in real time. Sometimes it looks like cutting your hair or straightening your hair, right? Or covering up your tattoos to be accepted, or wearing makeup every single day because you feel like that's the only way to move up and to be respected at work. And having those experiences, struggling through it, right? Struggling through it, not having a good time, and then allowing that experience to teach you like, this isn't even worth it. I'd rather just be me. It is more valuable and beneficial for me to be myself. So I'm going to cut off this relaxed hair and let it grow out into a fro. I'm going to let the rest of my hair grow. I'm going to wear a sleeveless shirt and show off these tattoos. You know what I'm saying? I'm taking off this makeup and I'm reclaiming my power. And sometimes that is just what the process looks like during that time period. And that is also okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, kind of that learning, like trial by fire, but also like allowing yourself to gain these gems of like being authentically me is perfectly enough, and I'm allowed, and I'm gonna. And I mean, I get it. In certain workplaces, it's a lot of politics and masking and all of that, and so kind of acknowledging that as well. It's not necessarily always in every scenario quite as simple as that, but right. There's ways that you can find kind of expressions of your authenticity and allowing yourself to be who you are naturally in those environments as well. And that recognizing it's just going to be a process. And I also recognize when you were saying that earlier of like, it's just going to take some time and it's going to be baby steps. And that's absolutely the case. And I also recognize that is really challenging for our perfectionist friends to handle and sit with. And so I know you shared some tips here of like kind of starting to sit with that. Are there any tips that you share, even just with being okay with like the slow process and the baby steps? You might have already shared a little bit, but anything else that comes to mind?
I think it does help for my clients to understand that their expectations of themselves are unrealistic, like the perfectionism, and providing them with the perspective of like, hey, can it be a relief to not expect yourself to be perfect? Can it be a relief to hear that you can still be happy? You can still have a good life. You can still make good money. You can still get married if you want to, or have kids if you want to. And none of that requires perfection. Can that be a good thing? Can that be a relief? But also, it also helps for them to understand the consequences of perfectionism as well, and to be able to tie that into why they feel the way that they feel, and to recognize and help them recognize that, like, hey, if this doesn't really change, how you feel is not going to change either. And that kind of allowing that to sink in, and for them to realize like, oh, I don't want to feel this way anymore. Okay, well, you know what? Maybe I don't feel like I can stop being a perfectionist today, but at least I'm receiving what you're saying. I'm going to keep it in mind. I understand what is true, what's real, and what's realistic. And as long as they have a commitment to trying to be aware of these things in their day-to-day, that's usually helpful. I also give my clients homework embracing imperfection. I also do that. So, I actually have a client who is a serious perfectionist, so much so that she can't draw a half circle. Like it has to be a full circle, like even down to the tiniest things. And so I gave her homework. I said, I want you to draw some half circles. Okay. Open up your journal and just draw it halfway. Draw a smile. Okay. Turn it into a little smile if you want to, but embrace perfection. Pick up a book, start it, and put it down, and don't feel like rushed or pressured to finish it anytime soon. Right. So that's something else that helps as well, almost kind of like an exposure therapy. Like, let's just expose you to the very thing you're terrified of in really small increments. And I do that so that they can realize that, okay, even though I feel uncomfortable or anxious because this doesn't look the way I want it to, or it's not complete, or it's not finished, or whatever the case may be, I can live through discomfort. I can live with the temporary feelings of this anxiety. There are no real consequences to this. My world doesn't end. People don't abandon me. I'm not going to live on the streets as a result of this. I still have food to eat. I'm still enrolled in school. The rest of your life is exactly the same. You just don't feel good. And so also explaining to my clients that does anxiety feel good? Of course not. Does stress feel good? Of course not. Does imposter syndrome feel good? No. Are these feelings going to kill you? No. And sometimes it's just about riding the wave. It's temporary. And then in therapy, you learn, okay, well, here's how you process these feelings. You have these feelings now. What do you do with them? I'm going to show you what to do with them. I'm going to teach you how to address these feelings on your own outside of our sessions so that you can learn how to self-soothe, so that you can learn how to process. You can learn how to reframe your thoughts. You can learn how to challenge negative or unrealistic or just false thoughts that come up in your mind. And so that you can self-soothe and learn how to practice self-care and realize okay, whew, that was really hard in the beginning, but I figured it out. I worked through it. And so with the repetition of those practices, that perspective, that process and time, it is going to help clients unlearn perfectionism and just embrace their imperfect selves and their imperfect realities as it is, and figure out how to make do with this, with what is actually achievable, with what is actually real. How can we do our best with what we actually have?
I love that. And it makes me think about how, not that you don't have parents as you are an adult, but the role naturally starts to shift as life cycles continue. And I just think that part of the process of adulting is learning how to parent yourself, like you're describing here, like that self-care, that self-advocacy, that attunement to emotions. And I definitely have experienced that with my work with clients where, if that wasn't an experience from a caregiver from before, it can be challenging to start knowing how to parent yourself on some of these really, life-altering decisions you're making or just feelings you're experiencing, to know how to have that internal dialogue or that coach of just I'm like a 6-inch person on my shoulder, kind of being like, hey, it's all right, Mandy, you're doing your best today. And that's good enough. That voice of a positive parent, I think is a big part of this, but it's a process of learning and knowing how to do that for yourself. And in which ways do you receive that parenting, if you will, towards yourself, kind of the compassionate stance versus the critical stance. And as I'm saying that, I just want to point out one thing I remember learning in grad school that has been pretty helpful for some clients within the 25-year marker, more or less around that age, of the quarter life crisis. I don't know if y'all have heard of that term before, but it's another way of just kind of, as both of y'all have brought this term of normalizing it too, of hey, you're not alone. You're kind of right on time to be feeling all of these stressors and to kind of have some big question marks around I don't know what to do. This is all overwhelming. And welcome. We're here with you, and we're going to get through it together, but I think it can be a little alarming because it's like, isn't it supposed to be fun? Because it's supposed to be like my freedom, like I'm out on my own, flying my wings. Yeah, but it kind of takes a lot of energy to fly, a lot of work.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. And you have to learn how to fly. Like, you don't just,
that's true.
you know what I'm saying? Like, it's a process to even figure out what does that actually look like. So yeah, it's gonna be afraid to jump out, and you're looking at the ground and you're like, oh my God, am I going to fall? I'm so scared. I'm so anxious. And then it's just taking that risk and taking that first step and figuring it out along the way. I imagine that's what baby birds do when they learn how to fly, right? And so it's the same thing for young adults. And you're so right. I also tell my clients, like, it may not feel like it, but you are on track with your development. You are exactly where you are supposed to be. We have all been here before. You're not an anomaly. You're not abnormal. There's nothing wrong with you. In fact, this is one of the most normal things about life, where you are at right now. And that tends to give them some relief as well. But yeah, there can be this expectation that, like, no, I'm supposed to be having fun and living my best life in my 20s. I don't know who lied to us. Somebody lied. Somebody lied to us saying your 20s are the best years of your life. Please. It's the most confusing. Like, it's just the wildest time mentally and emotionally. You're up and down. You change every single day. You don't know who you are. One day you want this, the next day you want that. It is a roller coaster of emotions. And so I always tell my clients, hey, I've been on this roller coaster before. It does stop eventually. It does slow down at some point, and you get a better grip on this ride. And so normalizing it is definitely helpful.
Yeah. And then the talk of kind of learning to reparent yourself and kind of figuring out what that's based on kind of reminded me of an earlier topic that we mentioned that we would come to eventually. So I just wanted to bring that around full circle in our last few moments here, of kind of for any loved ones of young adults or emerging adults. What are your suggestions for how they could support any of the young adults in their life, or even adolescents or before that? What are your suggestions for supporting them in this transition as they go along, if they're listening?
Yeah, I think a few things come to mind for me. Immediately, what comes to mind for me is like beginning to view their adult children as adults, right? And recognizing that they are their own beings, that they belong to themselves, that they do not belong to you. Like, that's the very first step before we do anything physically. Like, for parents, like mentally wrapping your head around the fact that they have become their own person. And it's important for you to cultivate that in that context. Second thing is like respecting the adult children's attempts to function and show up as an adult within the relationship. So not expecting an adult child to act like a child, or to acquiesce, or to do things that you want them to do that's not good for them, or to not set boundaries, right? So like, respect your kids' boundaries, respect their needs, be open when they say, I don't know if I can do that. You know what I'm saying? I have things going on. Let me get back to you. Respect their needs to limit access at times. Maybe they're not going to answer the phone every single time you call. Maybe they're going to give you a call back later. That has to be okay. But I think also talking to your kids, have conversations with them, teach them the things that they need to know, teach them the things that you wish you would have known when you were transitioning into adulthood. So teach them about building credit and how to write a check and how to date and what that should look like and feel like. Empower them to advocate for themselves, not just with everybody else, but with you too. Because here's the thing with parent-child relationships. If a young adult can really make a breakthrough in their relationship with a parent, it really empowers them to do the same in other areas of their life. So if a young adult can feel safe and comfortable coming to a parent and saying, you hurt my feelings, right? Or like, I wish you wouldn't have done that. I'm kind of disappointed in you. I've told my mom that before. I'm disappointed in you. If they can come to you and have those conversations, and it can be well received, and you're not, shooting them down and saying, how dare you? That's disrespectful. Don't you dare do that. Don't talk to me like that. Da, da, da. But you can engage in an adult conversation with your adult child, even if you're in the hot seat, and respect their perspectives and apologize, right? And give a good example of providing positive reinforcement for their attempts to show up as an adult in their relationship with you. That's powerful. It's powerful. It gives them the confidence to show up in that way in all the other areas of their lives, which is also part of being an adult. So teach them, talk to them, respect them, view them as the single individual human beings that they are, and continue to invest in the relationship and recognize that it's a transition for you too. It's a journey for you as well. It is not just up to your adult child to do the work. There's some work for parents to do too. And I think that that's a solid foundation to begin to cultivate the independence and the autonomy, and help your kid begin to make the transition into adulthood. And so this is, I will say that this topic, it can be easier to receive for a certain type of parent. Again, I have clients who are first gen and children of immigrants. I have clients who are Asian, South Asian, Hispanic, African, and it's a different story. It is really a different story. Culture plays a huge role. I have clients whose parents depend on them, but still treat them like a child, right? So it's like, you need to show up as an adult in this capacity, but in this capacity, don't you dare. Don't even think about it. I have clients whose parents continue to see them as a child until they get married, specifically for my women clients. And so in that capacity, it can be a lot harder to receive this feedback. And in some ways, especially if their parents were born in their respective country, in some ways, they just gonna kind of be like that. They are just going to have that perspective. And so it makes it more difficult for the young adult to establish their own independence and autonomy, especially when it is being discouraged from their parents repeatedly. And that's a harder journey to go on. But I do think for parents who are more progressive, more open, want their children to become self-sufficient, well-rounded, autonomous human beings, that's where they can start.
I think that's huge. I've supported a lot of families in the transition where the developing adult has a lot of anger and hurt towards their parents for maybe it is some of those cultural expectations, or it's also just like differing value systems. And I think what you're pointing out is really good to highlight again, which is it's hard for parents to make that adjustment, like they've fit a role in their life for, 18 plus years. And now all of a sudden it's an identity shift for parents. And I experience a lot of parents when they go through this transition grieving. It's that bittersweet, like, great, I'm glad that my kiddo is on their own, but also like, ouch, that kind of raises like where I'm at in my life. And now what do I do with my time and my energy in ways that I used to maybe invest more into my kids? I have to find new hobbies. And I really try to help my clients just think of their parents through that compassionate lens of, and through as much patience, not to, excuse harmful behavior by any stretch, but also just to try to imagine what it might feel like, for them making that transition. Cause, the adults having all kinds of feels about what their transition is coupled with that. So everyone I think can join in on like, hey, we're all just getting through this, it's going to be a little clunky at times, but we're kind of leading with just understanding and curiosity about like what else do we need in this transition to kind of feel wholehearted, but also not exactly equals necessarily, but a little bit more in that space than maybe what we experienced before, or we had to have as our family dynamic previously.
Right. Exactly. Leveling out the playing field, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And also just wanted to add a little touch on appreciating your mentioning the role of culture and how it can be really hard for certain parents of certain cultures to address those things, and how that can be extra challenging for those young adults. And so I think that kind of ties back to that conversation of learning to reparent yourself. And again, that can be really hard to understand what that even looks like or can feel like, but maybe just starting with like, what would I have needed from my parent in this moment, and how can I give that to myself? And just starting from there and starting to come from that place, and just acknowledging and working towards acceptance and processing through any grief and frustration that might be present too, of like, my parents are not going to get there. Like, that's just not going to be part of this process. And that's really, really tough. And just acknowledging like, that's a tough moment to deal with too. And I can also still meet my needs as best I can and unlearn the things that are not helpful in this way as I move towards this transition, and do that for myself. And so I appreciated you bringing that up, and I wanted to throw that in there. Was there anything else as we wrap up that any last thoughts? I think we've given a lot of thoughts as well, but any last thoughts or takeaways that we want to make sure to emphasize as people wind down with our conversation?
Yeah. Being an adult is a journey that doesn't end until we die. It's tough. It's full of ups and downs. Your feelings are valid always. There are going to be moments where you can, take what you've learned in this podcast and really apply it. And there's going to be moments where you're like, oh, fuck that. Like, no, I'm mad, I'm pissed. I'm miserable. I don't want to. And that is all okay. And what I hope people are able to keep with them from this podcast and use moving forward is that it really is all temporary. All of this is temporary. Each season is temporary. Each era is temporary. Each moment is temporary. Each feeling is temporary. And we all have the capacity to figure out a way to keep going and figure out this wild, wild journey of being an adult human being on planet Earth. And so I wish us all luck.
Yeah. I'm like, and on that note, what is the next right thing? What are we supposed to do next? Tell me, please, Zoe, help us. But we enjoy talking with you every time, Zoe. You have such great perspective, and I know you do such good work with everyone that you get to support. So I'm just so grateful that our paths have crossed, that we get to have these conversations, because I really enjoyed it. And I think, like, to your point, I think that people listening, it doesn't really matter where you're at on your adulting journey. It's just a reminder that like you said, there's no real finish line here. So in closing, to find you, I know we have your website, which is www.zoedthomas.com.
ZD Thomas.
ZD. Oh, thank you. Thank you. ZD Thomas. And we'll put these in the show notes too, so y'all can access it easily. And then your Instagram page, which is so fun, is School for Therapy, right? Like
School for Therapy
handle. Awesome. And so any other ways that you'd like for them to reach you, or is that kind of the best?
Yeah, I'm on TikTok as well at the School for Therapy, if TikTok is your main platform. But that's pretty much it other than that. So thank you guys for having me. I love our conversations. I'm also so glad that we met, and hopefully we can do it again.
Yeah, for sure.
Definitely. We appreciate it. I have to say this, given the moment of adulting, I'll speak for myself, but given the moment of adulting I've been in, this was so refreshing. So thank you, Zoe. Truly helpful for any part of your adulting journey, and really, really grateful both for you and your amazing perspective, as well as for the timing of our conversation.
Good. Thank you. I'm glad it was helpful.
Yeah. Thanks, Zoe.
Until next time.
All right.